Hi, Anna, and hi, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us. Um, I chose these vintages because they are extremely different. They are two ends of a spectrum, but they are both starting to drink. It's actually quite difficult when one talks about which vintages are drinking, because it very much depends on what level of quality and price you're drinking at. So, 2011s, there may be some sub £10 clarets that are really over the top now, but then, the Chateau Lasserre Saint-Emilion that Anna and I will be tasting later is only just starting to drink, and actually, in an ideal world, I would probably keep it a few years. So it's horses for courses, really. But so we are talking in general terms. But if people have specific questions about these vintages, or indeed any other vintages, I'm very happy to give my ha'porth worth based on the tastings that I do, and just general tastings of these vintages. So I think we're going to start, aren't we, Anna, talking about 2011. About 2 weeks after I joined the Wine Society, so I joined as head of buying, and I didn't actually have any specific Bordeaux functions, because I was whipping the buying team into shape when I joined in 2012. And about 3 weeks after I joined, it was the Bordeaux en primeur season. So I trooped off to Bordeaux with Joe Locke, who was the buyer at the time, and Sebastian Payne, who was the buyer for many years, and who still joins me in Bordeaux, actually, for en primeur tastings. We trooped off to Bordeaux, and nothing prepared me for the onslaught of A, the number of wines, but B, going out every evening. This was for almost an entire week. So tasting hundreds of wine during the day and then having to be nice to people at night. It was quite hard work. And allied to that, it's probably the hardest vintage in both senses of the word that I've tasted en primeur. Because the 11 vintage was tricky to make. It was, I think we described it in our en primeur offer as a vigneron's vintage, and it required very careful handling, both in the vineyard and in the cellar. So in the vineyard, you needed to make sure that you didn't have too many grapes, to make sure that they ripened properly. And in the cellar, not too much extraction, because the tannins were quite high. So it is a vintage that we would describe as classically styled. In other words, it's not a fruit bomb vintage. It's not got lots and lots of density of fruit. It's more in the old school style of winemaking. So the flavors that you get are, so the wines, in terms of their structure, they have maybe more tannin than a lot of vintages that people will have tasted recently. So more tannin than 15, more structure, quite spicy in style. So I use the word savory in quite a lot of my tasting notes, and somebody came up with another word, which is umami, which I have to say, I learnt that word a couple of years ago, and I think it effectively means more or less the same as savory. I think it is a taste sensation all of its own, but that, if you know what umami means, I think that describes quite well the 2011 vintage. What else can I tell you about it? We were quite selective in our offers of 2011. And I think we were quite careful to give long drink dates. In other words, not starting too soon, but actually going on for quite a while. What I have noticed, though, in probably only in the last year to 18 months, is that the 11s are really starting to come round. And I'm talking about really wines at cru bourgeois level and above. So let's say around 15 pounds a bottle plus. And the wines are just starting to sing. It's taken time, but it is a vintage of patience. So in front of me, I've got two different wines. Both are actually, well, one left bank, one right bank. So the first wine is our exhibition Pauillac from 2011. Still plenty of colour. This is the one that's from a very pucker source in Pauillac, and we buy, it's one of the wines that we buy and we don't reveal what the source is, but I can assure you that it is from a very pucker source. So the nose, for those of you who've got an 11 in front of you, it does have that kind of savoury edge to it. It doesn't kind of shout sweet fruit.
And Tim, whilst you're tasting, I'll ask, is that the same of the left and the right bank? So both have share that characteristic?
They both share that character, yes. That is common to left bank and right bank. So the Merlots are not as ripe as in some vintages. The alcohol levels are in check. So the Pauillac is 13.5, so it's not exactly low in alcohol, but people will have noticed that alcohol levels in general are increasing. Well, 11 certainly doesn't suffer from that. I don't think it's a vintage that was chaptalized. That's one way of increasing the potential alcohol, by adding sugar to the fermentation. But to be honest, Bordeaux hasn't really chaptalized for probably 20 years or maybe even more, because there haven't really been many vintages that have needed it. Possibly 13 had a little bit from some chateau, but generally not ubiquitous. So I think the sugar merchants of France have struggled to sell in Bordeaux in recent years. So I think the wine is starting to drink. I've decanted all the wines that I'm drinking tonight, and I certainly would recommend all 11s to be decanted, because air really helps to open them up and actually soften them up as well. And it's certainly a food wine. I would say that 15, which we'll come on to, they're wines that you can open a bottle and sit by the fire and just, with a friend or spouse, drink through the best part of the bottle. I would say that 11 vintage, you really do need some food to accompany it. And this is perfect with with a steak frite or something like that. It's really, it's got all the kind of structure, but it's also got the depth of flavor. So I would say that wine is just starting to drink. We actually give it a 2026 end date, but drinking it now, tasting it now, I think you could easily go beyond 26. And as time goes on, the wine will develop more tertiary flavors, so the kind of leather and cedar flavors that are quite that will be typical of this vintage. I think it's a classic vintage, and so it will develop those classic, what we call tertiary flavors. Second wine that I've got is a rather more upscale in terms of price. I didn't buy it myself. Anna kindly sent me a sample from stock. This is the Chateau La Serre, which is a Saint-Emilion Grand Cru Classé. It's a chateau that we don't buy every year, but it's because they do consistently make good wines. It's been in the Darfeuille family for many years, I think for several generations. And they tend to make a kind of style of wine that isn't the rich style that you sometimes get from Saint-Emilion. It is Merlot dominant. It's about 80% Merlot, but it doesn't have that really over the top kind of high octane style that some chateaux in Saint-Emilion have produced in the last 20 years. It's tasting, and I'll just give it a quick. I did taste it earlier, and it's starting to open up now. When I opened it up, though, there's a little bit of oak on the nose. That's now dissipated because it's probably an hour since I decanted it. So the style of the vintage is tending away from the opulent, but also the chateau style is also tending away from the opulent. So you're getting maybe less obvious right bank character, even though it is dominant Merlot. And I think this is a super bottle, and I think we give it an end date of 2030, and I think that's about right. No hurry to drink it, but it is a vintage that that will keep remarkably well, and that's because the tannins are present, it's structured, but also the acidity levels are quite good. So, you know, from a Saint-Emilion, from the Saint-Emilion escarpment, it's a lovely bottle, and I think I can't remember if it's in our fine wine list at the moment or what, but it is on sale. It's available on the website. So two really interesting wines that I think reflect very well the vintage. I can give you some product codes if people are interested, but they can be found on the website by just typing in Exhibition Pauillac and La Serre, that's S-E-R-R-E, Saint-Emilion.
Had a member request to see the labels as well, so I will just hold those up to camera.
There you go.
If you're interested, members, there we go. So the classic exhibition label, and then the La Serre in my other hand.
Yes, I mean, the thing to say about the Pauillac always needs a bit of time, and this is no exception. Pauillac often has the highest level of tannin of the left bank, of the top left bank appellations, the Medoc appellations. So it does take a bit of time. So it's nice that we're selling the 2011 vintage at the moment, because it's really, as I said earlier, it's starting to hit its stride. But there's no hurry to drink it, in my view. There's at least another 5 years in the tank.
And Tim, as the buyer, you've chosen to hold it back to sell it now. That's correct, right? You've chosen to keep these wines until this moment to sell.
Yeah. Yes, we give drink windows to all the wines. I mean, what members may not know is that we actually set the drink windows very, very early on in the wine's life, which is quite a tricky thing to have to do, but obviously it comes with experience. But, you know, these 11s, when I tasted them in spring 2012, I thought, wow, these are going to take some time to come round. And they have taken, you know, a considerable time to come round, but they've come good, as, you know, most of the you know, good producers from Bordeaux rarely slip up. And, you know, these are good examples of wines that require patience. And people have less and less patience these days. And wines tend to be made in a style that is more approachable, because people are not always prepared to sit on wines for 10 years. You know, this is 10 years old now, the La Serre and the Exhibition Pauillac. But the benefits are there for all to be seen if you do have the patience. And, you know, we store an awful lot of wine for members, because most members, I would say, prefer to drink their wines towards the end of the drink date than at the start. And I would certainly say that, you know, both these wines just beginning to come into their own, but absolutely no hurry to drink them.
Now, Tim, I have to say, some eagle-eyed members have spotted that if you download the wine notes on the website, you do actually get a hint as to which, well, certainly the producer of the Pauillac wine. I haven't got the notes to hand, but I understand it just says that it's a Rothschild wine. So
it isn't a Rothschild wine.
Oh, okay.
But it is a good, so previous vintages were from the Rothschild stable, yeah, but this isn't.
There we go. So we might have to tell our web tech team to update the downloadable wine note, because it might be out of date. So there we go, members. I had a couple of quick questions, maybe just about whilst whilst we're addressing the first two wines before we move into the 2015s.
Mm.
And we've had a couple of people ask about grape varieties. And I think it's quite a good point to just differentiate between left bank and right bank for those less au fait with the normal
Yes.
blend constitutions of those two styles of wine, I should say.
Yeah.
Lizzie.
Yeah. So very broadly speaking, the left bank, which is the Medoc, and the Medoc includes Saint-Estèphe, Pauillac, Saint-Julien, Margaux, and some of the lesser known appellations like Moulis that we'll be tasting shortly. But it also includes the Grave and Pessac-Léognan. So it's quite a large area. But the character of the soils and the microclimates of the area mean that Cabernet Sauvignon does particularly well. And the greatest wines of Bordeaux from the left bank are Cabernet Sauvignon dominant. So the Pauillac that we've just tasted, that will be predominantly Cabernet, probably I'd say about 60% Cabernet and about 40% Merlot. Merlot does well also, but you need to choose the right soils. So Merlot does well in the heavier soils, whereas Cabernet Sauvignon can thrive in the kind of gravelly, free-draining soils. So you can see the map in front of you. You see where it says Margaux. All that kind of stretch going north from just below Margaux. That's the kind of famous. Those are the famous communes of the left bank. And then where it says Pessac, so just south of the town of Bordeaux, the Pessac and Léognan, that's where you get your kind of Aubrions and your Aubailles and your Domaine de Chevaliers. So some very good left bank wines there. So those are the grape varieties you get on the left bank. And the styles of those two varieties are very different. So Cabernet Sauvignon tends to be more, it takes more to ripen Cabernet Sauvignon, needs more sun, ripens later, and it has less of an opulent character to it. It's more structured generally than Merlot, more tannin, but it has, and therefore more longevity than Merlot. You rarely get single varietal wines from the left bank. It tends to be a blend. And the great thing about Bordeaux is, unlike Burgundy, where you really only have one variety to play with, Pinot Noir if it's red, Chardonnay if it's white, Bordeaux vigneron can actually play around with the blends in their wine depending on the vintage. So if a vintage is particularly good for Cabernet Sauvignon and the wine and the varieties ripen, then you know the Cabernet Sauvignon element of the blend will increase. And the other side of that coin, of course, is there might be a vintage where it rained after the Merlots were picked, and therefore the Merlots make up a higher proportion of the blend. The style of Merlot is more about roundness, richness, opulence, and they don't have as much tannin. Their wines tend to be ready to drink a little bit sooner. So wines that are predominantly Merlot tend to be less keepers, although there are obviously exceptions to that. So that's the left bank. The right bank is kind of east of Bordeaux, and we may be able to show that up on the map. But the two famous appellations of the right bank are Saint-Emilion and Pomerol, and both regions are famed for their Merlots. So Merlot is the predominant grape variety. You do occasionally get wines that are 100% Merlot on the right bank, but the top wines tend to have a little bit of Cabernet Franc as well. Cabernet Franc acts as a foil to the richness of the Merlot. Interestingly, Cabernet Franc grows better on the right bank, Cabernet Sauvignon on the left bank. Cabernet Franc is a variety that also requires quite a bit of ripeness, but due to the soils and the microclimates, actually Cabernet Franc grows better on the right bank. And the interesting thing is that I've noticed in recent years there has been an increase in the amount of Cabernet Franc used on the right bank, so Saint-Emilion and Pomerol, for example. And the reason for that is that with climate change, Merlot, which ripens very readily, can become unbalanced if it's left too long. So what vignerons are doing is that they are either increasing their plantings of Cabernet Franc, which kind of tempers the richness of the Merlot, or they either plant Merlot vines to help the blend in the future, or they just increase the proportion of Cabernet Franc in the blend. So very generally speaking, that is what the difference is between the left bank and the right bank in terms of styles, but also in terms of grape mix.
Perfect, thank you very much. We have got the map up now as well, if you were...
Yes, so you can see where Libourne is there, and Libourne is the kind of town for Saint-Emilion, for Pomerol, sorry, and then the town of Saint-Emilion is close by as well. It's a bit further east, and those are the two main appellations, but you get a lot of satellite appellations. So you can see it says Puisseguin just to the east of Libourne there. Puisseguin, Saint-Emilion is one of the so-called satellite appellations of the right bank and of Saint-Emilion. Yeah, and
you we might even have a close-up map of that as well, which we can show you again later.
Sorry, I can't hear you, Anna.
Sorry, I was saying we've got a close-up map that we can show as well of a little bit more definition of that right bank, yeah, if Catherine's able to get it up, but if not to worry. I did have one more question before we moved on to the 15s. I'm very conscious of time, but it was leading on from the grape. Oh, here we go. Apologies. I think, here we go. So slightly, a little bit more zoomed in version here for you.
So you can see that, yeah, Château-Lasserre is in Saint-Emilion. The actual name of the town of Saint-Emilion doesn't appear, but Lasserre, yeah, so it's east of Pomerol and slightly further south. But the interesting thing is both Pomerol and Lasserre and Saint-Emilion, the best vineyards are the more raised vineyards on the escarpment. So there's the famous Pomerol Plateau and the famous Saint-Emilion limestone escarpment, and that's where the very best vineyards are. So, and the other interesting thing, which, sorry, I'm digressing a little bit, Pomerol has no classification, unlike most of the other regions of Bordeaux. So you can buy a Pomerol at 500 quid a bottle, and you can buy a Pomerol at £20 a bottle, and they both say Pomerol, whereas in Saint-Emilion, there is a virtually impenetrable classification system, which I have to say, I have to keep reminding myself every time somebody asks me about it, but the top wines like Cheval Blanc and Ozone are classified as Saint-Emilion Grand Cru Classé A, and then there are Saint-Emilion Grand Cru Classé B, then you've got Saint-Emilion Grand Cru Classé, then you've got Saint-Emilion Grand Cru, and then you've got Saint-Emilion. So, you know, pretty difficult to get your head around. And it doesn't necessarily mean just because something is Grand Cru that it's a great wine, just to make things even more confusing.
It's definitely not an easy area to navigate as a wine consumer. I can attest to that myself. Just, yeah, one final quick question on the 2011s before we move on to the 15s. Because of the grape blends, do you find that the right bank, i.e. the Merlot dominant wines, are perhaps drinking a little bit sooner than the left bank? Yes.
So, for example, a £49, so the Lasserre is £49 a bottle. I would say generally a £49 level left bank wine won't be ready for drinking yet. So, you know, if you said to me, is a I don't know, a Chateau d'Isson, actually probably Disson's a bit more expensive now, is Chateau d'Isson 2011 ready for drinking? I'd say probably not, because it's you know, it's got a higher Cabernet Sauvignon content and therefore tends not to be well, probably won't be ready for drinking. I don't think I've tasted that specific wine, but in 2011 recently. So yes, I would say the higher the Merlot content, generally the more ready the wine is for drinking.
Thank you so much, Tim. I think what's best in that case is to move on to the 15s. I appreciate we do still have lots of member questions about 11s, but we've also got all sorts of questions about vintages, varieties, all sorts of things that we can tackle after we've tackled 15. I'm conscious we need to get that part done. Yeah. That's rather important. So yes, if you're happy to give us a little overview on the 2015 vintage.
Let me tell you a bit about 15. So 15, by the 15 vintage, I think I'd taken over Bordeaux fully. There was a transitional period with Jo Locke where she did the non Primeur and I did the Primeur. But anyway, I certainly handled the 15 vintage for Primeur. So I talked at the beginning about contrast. You could not find a bigger contrast between going to Bordeaux and tasting the 15 vintage en Primeur compared with the 11 vintage, because the wines were everything that 11 wasn't. So in other words, they were not tough to taste. They were very easy to taste in broad terms. The wines were perfumed and silky, and tannins were riper and less obvious, less present. So it was actually a pleasure to drink that vintage or taste that vintage, and tasting 100 or more wines a day was less of a challenge than it was for the 2011 vintage. So you're in the presence of a vintage that is much less structured. There is plenty of fruit density, but it's not a concentrated vintage. A lot of people assume that because it's a good vintage, 2015, it's a concentrated vintage. So if you compare it with 2009 and 2010, which were both both excellent vintages, but were quite ripe and concentrated, 15 has a certain kind of lightness of touch, which actually I find very appealing. The wines are perfumed, they have silky tannins, they have a charm to them, which you know is a word that probably gets bandied about rather frequently, but I think the 15s have a charm to them. The other interesting thing about 15 is that it's a vintage that tasted well en primeur, and it's a vintage, I can't remember who suggested this to me at the time, but they said, oh, it's a vintage that is likely to drink well throughout its life. In other words, not go through a dip or a lean period, because some wines close up on themselves. Other wines just take a long time to come round, like the 11s. 15 hasn't really gone into its shell, and maybe will do, you know, at some point hence, but I suspect not. So the wines are have always been appealing. It was a relatively easy vintage to make, I think, from a winemaking point of view. I think if you made poor wine in 15, you might as well pack up your bags and go home, because I think 15, you know, was a very good vintage, pretty much. Well, I say across the board, but actually, I think it's probably worth pointing out that it was less consistent than 9 or 10 or 16 for that matter. So there was some rain in 15. The vintages the communes of the northern Medoc, for example. So that's Pauillac that we talked about a moment ago, and Saint-Estèphe. They did have quite a bit of rain at harvest time. So I was particularly careful in my selection of 2015 northern Medocs. But it was a very good vintage in Pessac and Léognan. It was an excellent vintage in Margaux. And I talked about Chateau d'Isson a moment ago. I tasted the 15 d'Isson today, actually. There was a tutored tasting by Emmanuel Cruz, the owner of Chateau d'Isson, and the 15 was just beginning to show well. So, you know, it is a vintage that showed promise when it was young and is actually living up to that promise. If anything, I would say the wines have come round a little bit sooner than I anticipated. So whilst the drink window, we're not going to play with the drink windows that I gave the wines in general, but some of them are already showing very well. I had a bottle the other night of, what was it? I've had a few bottles recently, obviously. I had, I'll tell you what it was. It was the Lacoste Bory, second wine of Grand Prix Lacoste. And the 15 is absolutely singing at the moment. I had a bottle also of 15 Baron de Brand, so the second wine of Brand Cantenac. That was less evolved, but it was also starting to drink. I mean, all the wines I'm trying tonight, I have decanted, and I would recommend, even in less structured vintages, decanting wine does help aerate the wine, and you get the full benefit of all the flavors. So I have actually decanted the 15s as well tonight. What else can I tell you about 15 vintage? Right bank, it was pretty good for Saint-Emilion and Pomerol. Saint-Emilion, it's probably an obvious thing to say, but the chateaus with the best terroir made the best wines, and there's a reason why they are the top chateaus. It's because they've got the best soils that are most adapted to the vagaries of the climate, and the top 15s from the right bank are superb. The wines from Moix and from Vieux Chateau Certain, Petrus, Lafleur Petrus, things like that are terrific. So I've got two wines in front of me, and I don't know if other people have got some 15s. So I have got a Pomerol, first of all, so a right bank. This is from Moix. So this is a wine that doesn't maybe have the opulence of some of the Pomerols from 2015, but it's got a lovely restrained, cool kind of berry fruit nose. It actually has a savory edge to it. So it's benefited from some time in the decanter, I have to say. When I tried it about a couple of hours ago, I thought it was just showing just a little bit angular, but that time in decanter has helped round it out. The tannins are softening up. There's no hurry to drink this wine. We give it a drink window of 2025. It's a wine that, a little bit like the 11s, I would say specifically this wine I would have with food because it's not quite hitting its peak yet. But there are other 15s like the Lacoste Bory that I mentioned, like the Baron de Brand, that you can certainly broach on their own and enjoy. So if it was a more modestly priced Saint-Emilion now from 2015, you probably don't need to actually have food with it. It's a nice wine just to enjoy the complexity of flavor on its own. So that's the exhibition Pomerol, which is £20. Alcohol levels in 14 were higher than in 11. In the 15 vintage are higher than in 11. So this is 14%, which is not untypical of Pomerol from the 15 vintage. In fact, if anything, I would say it's probably half a degree lower than a lot of Pomerols from the 15 vintage. This is from the Moix family, who are the kind of scions of the negociant fraternity on the right bank. They own chateaus, but they also have a negociant business, and we bought this wine from them. And it's a wine that we've sat on a little bit, and have started offering it relatively recently. And I think there's no hurry again to drink this wine. Okay, what have we got? So, yeah, that gives you a feel for where Pomerol is in relation to. You can't see Bordeaux on that map, but It's kind of, yeah, right bank. Not sure that adds a great deal from the last map, actually, but
just along from Saint-Emilion. So,
yeah. So this will be a blend from various different vineyards in the Pomerol appellation. It's good. So that's the right bank 15, and I would say that's on the less opulent end of the spectrum for 15. There are wines that are considerably higher in alcohol. I think we did actually have some 2015s that were 15% in alcohol. Not many, but you shouldn't just look at the alcohol level on its own, because appreciating wine is all about the balance of the wine. So as long as the constituent parts of the wine are balanced, so in other words, the fruit, the acidity, the tannins, the alcohol, even if it is raised, even if it's 15%, the wine can still be balanced. So, if you taste one of Marcel's Rhônes from Châteauneuf-du-Pape, quite often they're 15%, but rarely does the alcohol taste excessive, because the wine has balance. And so I think it's slightly misleading just to talk about alcohol levels on their own. I think you need to take it in the context of the whole, take a holistic view, if you like, of the wine. So that's the right bank 15 that I decided on for this evening. The left bank is, there you go, there's the exhibition Pomerol. The left bank wine, which I'm sure Anna is going to show you now. My handy assistant, thank you. So this is a wine that's been a member favorite for years. This is Dutrouche Grand Peugeot. So this is your left bank equivalent of it's the left bank counterpart to the Pomerol that we've just tasted. Dutrouche Grand Peugeot is in Moulis. Now, Moulis is not one of the top 4 communes of the left bank, the top 4 being Margaux, Saint-Julien, Pauillac, and Saint-Estèphe, but it's kind of the next one down. And in ripe vintages like 15, Moulis can produce some really good wines. So this is made, it's a small family-owned property. There you go. You can see it on the map. So Moulis is north and west of Margaux. It tends to be cooler, and therefore in warm vintages you get the ripeness. It tends to have slightly heavier soil, so the wines maybe don't have the finesse of, say, a Margaux, but they're good value, and this wine is £20. Let's have a taste. This is a wine that I particularly like, I have to say.
And so, Tim, you mentioned earlier as well that Margaux was particularly good in 2015 compared to perhaps the more northern areas. Does that ring true as well for this wine being so close to Margaux?
Yes, I mean, it was consistent in 15 vintage Moulis. It had a because it's so close to Margaux, it had a similar climate over the course of the growing season, but obviously the soils have a different makeup, and therefore the blends maybe are different from Margaux, typical Margaux, and so the style is slightly different. It's a little bit more structured than the perfume of Margaux. It doesn't have that Margaux perfume. So this is a wine that I decanted about an hour ago. It's starting to drink well, but I think this is a wine that we can keep quite happily. We've got a drink end date of 2031, and it will last amply that long. Monsieur Chardronnier, who owns the Jean-Baptiste, who owns, well, he's sold it to his brother now, but who owned the chateau at the time, was making wine from, I think, the 93 vintage at Dutrouche. And he said to me when I tasted it en primeur with him that it was he thought the best vintage that he'd made at the chateau. So even better than 9 and 10. And although the wine is starting to come out of its shell, I think its best years are ahead of it. You can perfectly happily drink it now with food, but I personally would hang on to it. I've got some of it in my cellar and I haven't touched it yet. But we are offering it at the moment, and it's £20, and I think it's a bargain. The great mix for the Dutroux, I do actually have that. It's so it is Cabernet Sauvignon dominant, 58% Cabernet Sauvignon, 36% Merlot, and then there's a couple of, well, there's 3% each of Cabernet Franc, which you don't see a lot of in the Medoc. In fact, you see decreasing amounts in the Medoc generally, and 3% Petit Verdot, which is the other variety of Bordeaux, which I haven't really mentioned. And that's a wine that has the structure to last. So again, no hurry at all to drink it. So there you go. You've got the two different contrasting vintages. I don't know if people want to start asking questions, or did you have anything else that you wanted to raise, Anna?
No, I think that's fantastic. We've got lots of questions, and I think for the next 15 minutes, why not explore them? I would say that the Dutroux is getting a great write-up on the chat. So there's a few people.
Oh, good. Good.
And I have to say, for the price, it really is cracking. So
yeah.
Lovely. So let's stick with the 15 vintage if it's all right. Richard Winter has asked, how does the 2015 vintage compare with the magnificent 2010? So I wondered if we could maybe do a bit of a compare and contrast.
Yes. So 2010 is a fantastic vintage. I would probably put 2010 marginally. It's go back one step. Every year, although this year is going to be the first year I haven't done it for a long time, I and a group of like-minded Bordeaux buyers and journalists taste about 200 or 250 wines from a particular vintage, all done blind over a course of 2.5 days. I can't do it this year, but this year would have been for the 2018 vintage. But when I did the 2015 vintage, it really did show particularly well. The wines, as I've said already, 15 are starting to be approachable, but there's no hurry to drink it. But what we do at the end of the 2.5 days of tasting is we try and rank the previous 10 years vintages. It's a bit of a kind of blunt implement because it doesn't take into account the nuances of left bank, right bank, but it just gives an overall impression for which vintage we think is the best, or the ranking of the vintages over the past 10 years. And I think 2010 comes above 2015, and I would put it marginally ahead, but only marginally. 10 is more concentrated. So I mentioned earlier that 15 is not a vintage that is concentrated, but it's got lovely sweet fruit, it's got charm. 10 is more powerful, I would say. The 10s have taken longer to come round than the 15s will, because they've got more structure. They've got a little bit more alcohol even than 15, I would say, in general. Concentrated but beautifully balanced. So 10 is a super vintage, and I would be very happy to have lots of 2010s in my cellar. I don't have many at all, but I've got other vintages, but 10 I didn't buy particularly heavily because I'd bought quite a bit of 9.
Okay, lovely. Could I ask the same question about 2016, if that's all right? We've actually got quite a few members drinking 2016 wines.
Yes, well, 16 I ranked at the top of all the 10 vintages, and I think most of my colleagues put it in the top 1 or 2. So for me, 16 has everything. It's got class, it's got balance, it's got approachability. It's got everything, really. So if I had to say, hand on heart, which vintage of the last 10 years I would want most of in my cellar, I would say it's probably 16, but there have been some phenomenally good vintages in the last 10 years. So it's really being nitpicking, putting 16 at the top. But 16 is a super vintage.
Lovely, thank you. There was a bit of a sort of less impressive period in the middle, the 13s, 14s, etc. Is there a reason that those vintages suffered? Was it a climactic thing? Was it weather?
It's the weather. Yeah, it's purely the weather, and that's the great thing about Bordeaux is it's not homogeneous in terms of vintage to vintage. Bordeaux has a maritime climate that can catch vignerons out, and however sophisticated viticulture is these days and how sophisticated winemaking techniques are, you will get vintage variation in Bordeaux. And that's what makes Bordeaux interesting for me, because if every vintage tasted the same, my job would be very boring. And a trip to Bordeaux to taste the new vintage en primeur wouldn't be nearly as exciting as it is. So 13 was probably the weakest vintage of the last 10 years, but it still has its interest. The wines are more approachable, they're lighter, but they have a certain charm to them as well. So I don't think you can rule out 13 as a vintage. And I've had plenty of good bottles. I had a bottle of the 13 Bataille the other day, and it was lovely. So 13 is in the great scheme of things, a less good vintage, but don't discount it. 14, I think the best is yet to come. I wouldn't say 14 was a weak vintage in any way, shape, or form. It's just less obvious maybe than certain other vintages like 15 and 16, and like 9, and like 10, and like 18, and like 19. We've been blessed with so many good vintages.
On that note of talking about weather and vintages, we've had a lot of people talking or asking rather about the impact that climate change is having on vintage variation in Bordeaux. I know it's a huge topic, and you actually wrote a piece recently on it, Tim, as well, but maybe a minute on a huge topic.
Yes, and I mean, this is a subject that comes up virtually in every webinar I've done in the last year, and I've done quite a few, as Anna will confirm. The subject of climate change comes up repeatedly, and quite rightly, because climate change is a concern to winemakers and wine drinkers. Yes, there have been a lot of warm vintages in recent years. There have been some exceptions, which we've talked about: 14 less warm, 11 less warm, 12 not particularly hot, but we are getting wines that are potentially shifting in their character, and that is due to the climate. So I talked earlier about the right bank wines. Quite a few right bank producers increasing the Cabernet Franc content of their blends and reducing the Merlot content, and that is as a direct result of climate change and people needing to rein in the richness of Merlot. And I think winemakers are, learning. They are lucky that they have long-term weather forecasts now, which allows them to pick the optimum time for their grape, in terms of the right time of day. So quite often they're picking early morning to make sure that the fruit isn't too hot. They're changing their viticultural techniques to adapt. They're developing new strains of yeast to help with the fermentations to moderate the impact of very, very ripe grapes. So Bordeaux is adapting. And I did write a piece last year about new varieties that have been authorized for the generic Bordeaux level wines, Bordeaux and Bordeaux Superior, things like Touriga Nacional from Portugal, and that is in a bid to moderate the effects of climate change. So I think climate change is something that's not going to go away, and I think Bordeaux has the know-how and the the top chateaus have the money to know what to do when they are faced with a challenging, very hot vintage. 2020 was a challenging vintage. I've been in contact with various producers to get a first impression of 2020. Some of them are raving about the vintage, and I think by all accounts it will be a very good vintage, but it's patchy, I think, in quality, and I think there will be more vintage variation. Variation between communes and regions of Bordeaux in 2020 vintage as a direct result of the climate.
Thank you very much. For members, I think Gil has popped in, or Catherine rather maybe, has popped in the articles that Tim's referring to into the chat, but I will include them in the follow-up email tomorrow as well if you're interested in reading up a bit more on those. We've got loads and loads of questions actually on particular wines, and I'm going to avoid those unless we have a couple of minutes spare at the end, if that's all right. But rest assured, if you have asked Tim about whether a particular wine is drinking, we will answer those over email completely. And we'll also send the email around to everyone. So if you share similar wines with members, you'll get multiple answers. But I think it's important talking about vintages and talking about when to drink certain wines. Obviously, when to drink is largely a personal preference anyway, and a few members have asked for a bit more of a comment on how Bordeaux wines evolve. So sort of what is the evolution of the flavor profile of a wine from Bordeaux?
Yes, well, it's very interesting to map the way wines do evolve, and I think I mentioned earlier that quite a lot of members tend to wait towards the end of their drink dates to drink their wines. I actually like young wines, and I'm very happy drinking Bordeaux quite young. In a way, if I come across a wine that should have been drunk 2 years ago, I find it more frustrating than opening a bottle that's going to start drinking in 2 years. But basically what happens is when wines are young, depending on the vintage, the wines have tannins that are more present in general. The wines have what we call primary flavors and aromas. So you're getting more plums, and you're getting chocolate, and you're getting berry fruits, and these are kind of what we call primary flavors. What happens as the wine evolves is that you get secondary and tertiary flavors. So the wines start to well, you can see from the color that the wine is evolving. So they go from being crimson, deep reds and purples to kind of brick reds. And then eventually they have a slightly brown tint to them as the wine evolves. I talked about cedary, leathery notes, and those are the kind of notes that you get towards the end of a drink window. And some people like that, other people don't like that. You get kind of minty flavors sometimes developing later on in a wine's life cycle. So generally the wines lose a bit of body as they age. They gain in what some people call complexity of flavor. So you get more nuances maybe in the wine with age. But as I say, I do like some of the vibrancy of the fruit of young wines, and you lose some of that vibrancy in time. I mean, it is amazing when you come across really old vintages how there is still some sweetness to the fruit and some vibrancy, but it tends to be in the more kind of serious vintages that you get that.
Fantastic, thank you very much. I have got so many questions, and I'm going to, Tim, I'm going to be stealing your time over the next few days to get a couple of them answered, and then hopefully we'll get the rest answered.
Sure, no problem.
But I think to end, obviously people have poured hopefully a couple of wines this evening. You'll have seen that I actually just poured mine out into glasses. For anyone who didn't get my email, it's a good way. I don't have 4 decanters, unlike the likes of Toby Morale or possibly you, Tim. So I poured mine into glasses. But do you have a recommendation on simply the best way to enjoy wines of Bordeaux, and in particular these two vintages. Does one need longer decanting than the other? Is there a glass that that we should use?
So I always decant Bordeaux, even whether it's young, whether it's old. The older the wine, the less time it needs in a decanter. So if it's towards the end of its drink window, don't give it too long, because the wine can start to oxidize in the decanter. So decant it to get the sediment away, but drink it immediately. In terms of temperature, I think temperature is vital in red wines. Getting the temperature right. So many people and so many conflicting stories about temperature, but for me, don't serve a wine too warm. Bordeaux should not be more than 17 degrees at the most. We talk about cellar temperature, and if you're lucky enough to have a cellar, don't take the wine out and put it next to the Arga, because it'll kill the wine. This time of year, if you don't have a cellar, but you have a window ledge or a garden, stick the wine outside for 20 minutes, because the wine can always warm up, but it's so disappointing to mask some of the lovely flavors if you serve the wine too warm. So always start cool and let the wine come up to a temperature that feels right. So temperature is vital as far as I'm concerned for Bordeaux. The last thing is glasses. This is a Riedel Bordeaux glass. I wouldn't normally use this for a masterclass, but I do have quite a few of these, and it is well adapted to drinking Bordeaux. But you can go for small. I'll grab a couple of glasses from my cupboard and just show you.
I think Tim's been speaking to my future father-in-law about the Arga trick. That's certainly something I've had to contend with going over for Sunday lunch, where I slowly move wine away from the Arga, where it's been slowly cooking.
So the kind of wine glass that I normally use for tastings and just for everyday drinking is this kind of size and shape. This is perfectly good because it's kind of tulip shaped. So when you stick your nose in it, you get the aromas. I wouldn't go much smaller than that personally, because I think if you're spending a decent amount of money on a bottle, you might as well have a good sized glass. The Rolls Royce of glasses for me is Zalto, and I do actually have some Zalto glasses. This is the Zalto Universal glass. You can see how delicate it is. So I only bring these out for kind of special wines. But if you can afford a Zalto glass, and they're talking kind of 30 quid for a stem, which is very expensive, but they are terrific. And tasting wine out of very, very fine stemware is a real luxury. It makes a good wine taste great, but you can spoil a great wine with a relatively modest glass. So it does pay to have a nice big glass. But these Riedel Bordeaux are great for everyday use of good wines, I would say.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Tim. Yes, I don't trust myself with the Zalto, sadly, and I certainly don't trust my other half. He's not got the best track record of not breaking glasses. So I think until we can get that under control, I'm going to stick with my, these are actually, dare I say it, they're from IKEA, but they've really served me well. I use them for tastings. Yeah,
that looks the perfect size, Anna, and that looks like a really good option. I think Freddie, who does does Freddie do our?
He used to, Matthews.
Oh, it's Matthew now, yeah. Well, I think Freddie introduced some new glasses to the Wine Society, so it's probably worth looking online at what we've got. I have to say, I've got glasses coming out of my ears, so what we're offering recently, but probably worth looking at that.
Wonderful. Right. I'm conscious of the time. Members, I do hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. I'm sure you're rushing off to hopefully finish off either a gorgeous 2011 or gorgeous 2015 with some food. And you can test out Tim's theory that the 11s need some grub to go with them. As I said, lots and lots of questions still unanswered, and I do apologise, but those will be answered over email, and I'll send all of the answers round to everyone as well. Can't thank all of you enough for joining us this evening. Lots of you had all 4 of the same wines open, so I hope you had a very pleasant Wednesday. And last but very much not least, I'm going to grab my Pauillac, a huge thank you and cheers to Tim Sykes for joining us this evening and sharing an absolute wealth of Bordeaux knowledge, stories and insights that I'm sure that we're all very appreciative of. So thank you very much, Tim.
Thank you, Anna, and thanks everybody. Very good turnout tonight. I'm very pleased to see that so many people are interested in Bordeaux, because it makes my life fun that I can go out and buy lots of Bordeaux for the society. But also thank you behind the scenes to Catherine and Gil, who've put in a lot of the spade work for this evening. So cheers, everybody.
Absolutely. Cheers all. Thank you very much.